Good evening and welcome to our webinar entitled An Overview of the Prevention and Accountability Resolution. This webinar will be in preparation for the Delegate Assembly that's coming up in July, and it deals specifically with a particular resolution about how the Prevention and Accountability resource sits in our system. So looking forward to this time together. I'm your host, Michael Danner. I'm the Associate Executive Director for Church Vitality and Mennonite Church USA. Tonight I am joined by John Carlson, MCUSA Moderator, Amy Zimbelman, Conference Minister for Mountain States Mennonite Conference, Eric Massanari, Executive Conference Minister for Pacific Northwest Mennonite Conference, and Heidi Regier-Kreider, the Conference Minister for Western District Conference. Welcome and thank you for being with us. Tonight's gathering is in webinar format, so all attendees are muted and the chat is disabled. We will, however, be posting some links in the chat. Spanish interpretation is available using the globe button at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is also being recorded, and you will receive a link in a follow-up email. And all of our webinars are available on our YouTube channel. Please feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. There'll be a time of Q&A at the end of our conversation, and we'll do our best to answer all the questions submitted there and also pre-submitted for this webinar. Before we get started, let me open us in prayer, and then we'll jump in. Gracious God, we thank you for this time we have together, and we thank you for every person that is present during this webinar and those that will see it later as we talk about these important matters for the church. I just pray that you will guide us and be present by your Spirit as we figure out or talk together about how we do life together as followers of Jesus. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. We're going to begin with John Carlson, who's going to give us an overview of the resolution. Thank you, John.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. And I do want to express my appreciation, Michael, while we're on this call together, for all the work that you and your team have done in getting the denomination to this point, both with the resource itself as well as helping the executive board think through how this gets implemented in our system. I think for the entire time I've been a member of the executive board, you have been working on this in some way, shape, or form, often doing the work of 3 or 4 people all at once. I know this is not anyone's favorite subject to deal with or address, and you have been up to your neck in it for a good long time. And so I just really want to thank you on behalf of the whole church for the work that you have done. As Michael said, we're not here to talk directly about the prevention and accountability resource. There was an excellent webinar done on that a few weeks ago that is available on YouTube. We're really just talking about how this gets implemented within our system. And the way that we're going about that is a resolution that the executive board is presenting to delegates in Greensboro in a little under a month from now, that in essence makes 2 changes to our bylaws, adds language committing congregations and area conferences to utilizing this prevention and accountability resource as the way that they respond to allegations of misconduct by credentialed leaders. So it's those 2 amendments, those 2 changes to the bylaws that I want to talk a little bit about, sort of how we got here and how why we're recommending this change for delegates to consider. And there are a couple sort of factors that I think have influenced our thinking on this as an executive board, and really I think the thinking of the entire church, or at least a strong majority of the church, as we've tried to work at this question of how do you prevent misconduct from happening, and how do you ensure that there is accountability if misconduct does occur. So I just want to talk through a couple of those factors that have led us to this point. One of which is that we as a denomination have been wrestling with questions of misconduct in a pretty intensive way for well over a decade now, going back even further than that. Probably the most notable example of that is reflecting on everything that went wrong in John Howard Yoder's ministry and life, where there was extensive misconduct that was not well addressed within the system. And I think part of what we've learned through that is that as important as it is to train individuals, individual pastors, individual credentialed leaders, individual area conference ministers, part of what went wrong there really was a systemic failure. The system as a whole broke down. And so part of what we're trying to do with this resolution is to implement systemic changes for systemic challenges. So rather than just think about this in an individual way, to try to think a little bit more systematically and systemically, and to do that through updating our bylaws. This has been happening, of course, in a time when the broader culture is also has a growing awareness, a greater awareness of things that can go wrong, particularly in faith communities, when faith leaders abuse the trust that is placed in them. We've seen this in other Christian traditions, the Catholic Church and the Southern Baptist Church being 2 really notable examples. As leaders in the Mennonite Church, we've paid close attention to the Southern Baptist Convention's experiences because while there are certainly a lot of differences in terms of size, scale, scope, theology, there are also some similarities in terms of polity. And so there are a few things that we've learned by observing what the Southern Baptists have had to deal with and how they've responded. One thing that we've learned is that no matter how decentralized your structure is, no matter how much you emphasize congregational autonomy, there is a real moral responsibility and in some cases legal liability for a denomination that authorizes pastors and clergy to minister within their system. So the Southern Baptists are very, very decentralized, place a high value on congregational autonomy, as Mennonites do, and when there is widespread and systemic abuse, it reflects on and implicates the denomination. So we've looked at that and tried to learn from that. I think what we've also seen, sadly, especially in the last few years, is that I think the Southern Baptist Convention really did some admirable work in trying to address this, but some of that work is now being rolled back or de-emphasized. It didn't really take root at a systemic level in a way that could have been beneficial. So I think we've hopefully learned something from that and saying we want to try to implement some of these changes systematically. So those are two sort of like historical and cultural things that have been going on. And then as Michael and his team have been working at this resource, we've also engaged with input from outside experts. And what those outside experts have told us is that Mennonite Church USA, as we all know, is a relatively small denomination, and we are a highly interconnected denomination. An awful lot of us are related pretty closely. And so what these experts have told us, looking at our system from the outside, is they said that the way that you go about addressing misconduct and trying to have that response happen at a local or area conference level, that has a very low probability of success because of how small you are, how interconnected you are. It creates all sorts of complexities and sometimes even outright conflicts of interest. So what we're trying to do is respond to that feedback that we've received by bringing these recommendations, bringing this resolution to the delegates. And then we've also heard, and you're going to hear more directly, we've heard from leaders in our area conferences that they would really like to see this be something that we're able to do together as a national body, not just at the area conference level. So as this prevention and accountability resource has been developed and tested with conference leaders, particularly conference ministers. We've gotten feedback that this type of resolution, this type of bylaw change would be really welcomed by most of our area conferences. So this has been tested at conference ministers gatherings, as well as constituency leader council meetings. So the constituency leaders council, that is always a tough phrase for me to say. The constituency leaders council met in the beginning of May in Wichita at the same time the executive board was meeting. We actually had some joint meetings as well during that time, working through exactly this question. And we received really, really overwhelmingly supportive feedback from CLC. So this would be conference moderators, conference ministers, as well as other representatives of conferences and recognized constituency groups. We received really, really positive feedback for presenting this change to delegates and a strong hope that delegates will ratify this. So that's some of the background of how the executive board got here. It's the work that Mennonite Church USA has been doing in recognizing that there have been systemic failures in our past in responding to abuse and misconduct, paying attention to what's going on in the culture around us, as well as other Christian traditions and trying to learn from that. Feedback we've gotten from outside experts and feedback we've gotten from area conference leaders. So with that, I think we're going to turn it over to some of those conference leaders and hear more directly from them how this is going to help strengthen them in the work that they do.
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, so we're talking about the resolution, and we have Eric and Amy and Heidi are going to talk about a bit about how they think this resolution or how they're thinking through it, and also if this resolution passes, how that might impact their conference. And then we've also asked, as you read this resolution, are there any reservations or concerns that you may have? And so we'll start, we'll go in this order, Eric, and then Amy, and then Heidi.
Thanks, Michael. And thank you to you and John for inviting us as conference ministers into the conversation today. And that's something I will just highlight to begin is I really appreciated in this process that both in the revision of the abuse prevention and accountability policies and in the process leading to this particular resolution, it's been a collaborative one. And I think that's really important for people to be aware of. And John spoke to that. And for my part, as a conference minister, I really appreciate that collaboration and collective discernment process. The area conferences, of course, where a significant amount of work is done around abuse prevention and accountability. And so I feel like this process leading to this resolution has recognized and affirmed that. And so for that, I just want to express gratitude. I also want to note I'm relatively new to conference work, newer than Amy or Heidi. I've been in this role about 2.5 years now. And I'll share that one of the first orienting tasks that I took on in my first year in this role was reading through ministerial misconduct and abuse files we had within this conference for the last 3 decades. And that was, needless to say, very sobering and heartbreaking work to read through those files. As I did that, one thing that was really clear to me is that we've learned a lot along the way collectively. We continue to learn to do better in the realm of abuse prevention and accountability. And that much of that hard-won wisdom and learning has come through the courageous efforts of abuse victims and survivors in the church, and the awareness that we've not always done well by those victims and survivors. Sometimes our past practices and policies, our silences, our neglect has doubly harmed victims and survivors. And so I feel like we have to collectively join in a humble commitment to continued learning and change. Which leads me to these revised policies, and particularly this resolution we're talking about today. I think this is helping us move in that direction even more. After joining in discernment with the nominational staff, with John and as executive board membership and conference leaders, I feel really clear that this resolution is a helpful way to embrace and commit to the changes together. I think this resolution gives us an opportunity to gather as a delegate body of our denomination and to say in one voice that preventing and confronting ministerial abuse and misconduct is among our highest priorities in the church. And so I think there's great value in that unity of commitment that we make together, rather than simply hoping that all of our conferences will individually choose to opt in to and to adopt these changes in practice and policy. So that unity and commitment feels really important to me. And then secondly, I would just name, I think it's also important because I think this resolution helps us commit to a consistency in practice. Passing this resolution assures me as a conference minister that all of our MCUSA regional conferences and staff are committed to implementing the same practices and policies with their credentialed leaders in their region. In the past, I think that lack of consistency in practice has contributed to some patterns of ministerial misconduct and abuse in the church. And so I think we will benefit from this very intentional collective affirmation of this resolution and adopting the policies. So yeah, I think those are the two things. I want to hand it over to Heidi and to Amy, but I really think that the unity and commitment, the consistency in practice are really two things I'd want to highlight why I feel good about this resolution.
Thanks for sharing, Eric. And thank you for having me on this panel. So in thinking about this resolution, I want to build a little bit on what's been said and highlight one major thing that is at stake in my understanding of it. So just to get on the same page, so currently our MCUSA bylaws do not say that we as a denomination have an accountability process for credentialed leaders that we all agree to. That's not on the books. So without a consistent accountability process, this leaves room for a given MCUSA conference to be more lax on accountability than another conference would be. And this means that a credentialed leader could seek out that lax conference or conferences before or after doing harm, knowing the consequences may be very different for them, just by virtue of geography, right? So we have heard in the news, and John Carlson just mentioned about Catholic priests who are moved around to escape accountability. And unfortunately, there are MCUSA pastors in the past who have moved based on the harm they've done to escape some accountability. So this is, in my mind, a huge factor that's at the heart of the problem. Without consistency, there can be loopholes so that harm can go unchecked and more harm may happen, unfortunately. So just like doctors or teachers or therapists have consistent ethical standards across the country, it only makes sense that clergy would too. My dad is a medical doctor, and he just told me yesterday that doctors in the 1990s is when it became standardized for them, and that he did notice a difference in the profession, that folks could not just skip town when something went wrong. So if that's the issue at hand, then I think we're working for a denomination where every person who is part of an MCUSA ministry is treated with respect and care, and that if harm occurs, there is a fair, robust, and consistent process to deal with that harm. This, in my view, this bylaw addition is a legitimate step towards that vision. We agree to have this shared understanding of how to prevent and respond to harm. So one thing that we conference ministers have been processing through is how all of this works polity-wise. I think this is going to come up this evening a little bit. And I just want to note that this is an addition to the bylaws. So we already agree to abide by the MCUSA bylaws. And so like an example of this would be if at MenoCon this year, if a congregation of 50 members came to MenoCon and said, hey, we want 25 delegates to vote, right? Someone would tell them, I'm sorry, you get one delegate and one youth delegate as per the bylaws, right? In the same way, if a leader receives a misconduct complaint, the bylaws would now give guidance, if this passes, and says, here's what you do, right? You can't just say, oh, I don't feel like dealing with this. No, you go to the current policy, you follow step 1, 2, 3, right? And we would just all agree to a more consistent approach, just like we all agree to have a certain number of delegates represent each church. So we're already agreeing to these shared documents. So one thing that Michael Danner asked was, if this passes, how would it impact your conference? And like Eric said, I see this as a move towards community and continuity and common understanding. I see it as something that codifies a culture that is protective of the most vulnerable and marginalized among us. You have heard that. You'll hear it from me. I know you'll be hearing it from Heidi too. This is really important to us conference ministers, that folks in our churches are safe and protected. And I want to say also that it's protective to everyone when we adopt a misconduct process that is lawyer vetted, that's expert approved, that church leaders, conference ministers, that we've all given feedback on together. It gives guidance, so we're all less likely to get sued, which is a real risk these days, and we're less likely to act unethically, which is, I would say, more important. And that's because we're not flying by the seat of our pants. This all has been thought through carefully, and we're all agreeing to it. So all that to say, I personally believe that passing this resolution would have a very positive effect on our conference and on our whole denomination, and it'll make the whole system healthier. So thank you. I will pass it off to Heidi.
Well, thank you for having us this evening. Thank you, Eric and Amy, for what you've offered here so far. And I will probably echo a number of things that Eric and Amy said, because as conference ministers, we have been in conversation. We've been thinking about this, sharing thoughts about it. And at this point, I want to again reiterate that what we are talking about tonight is the bylaws resolution. We're not focusing particularly on the content of the prevention and accountability resource, which will be the resource that we are going to be, that will be available to us in Mennonite Church USA going forward. But we're focusing on having bylaws changed and added to clearly state that this is our shared commitment. So I want to just emphasize that I think the approval of the bylaws resolution would be a clear communication of a shared commitment that we have to healthy congregational life and the prevention of abuse. It would intentionally signal that our denomination prioritizes the well-being of children, youth, vulnerable adults, and values healthy accountability and support for credentialed ministers and other leaders, and really for all of us. This is an attractive message about the kind of people and the community we want to be. I believe that giving this message by approving the resolutions would be a hopeful and positive witness that congregations can share with their community and their members, and that conferences can share with their congregations and with prospective ministerial candidates. We can point to this and say, here, this is what our denomination prioritizes. In addition to being a shared theological and moral commitment, the prevention and accountability resource can really only function through a shared denominational structure of administration, of implementation, and of resourcing that conferences and congregations participate in. The resource includes a level of denominational administration, and so no congregation or conference can function with it by themselves. And the bylaws resolution reflects that very functional reality that this is a denominational resource. I think that to approve the bylaws resolution would also clarify and articulate the executive board's authority to approve a prevention and accountability resource for our denomination in consultation with conference ministers. And as conference ministers, we appreciate that opportunity for consultation and feedback to the executive board. And I believe that clarity is helpful in defining roles and responsibilities within our denominational structure so that we know who is responsible for what and how we work together. Again, I would echo what Eric and Amy have already noted, that the proposed bylaws would provide consistency in practice, or would state the importance of consistency in practice across all conferences. And in addition to the very foundational purpose of promoting safe church practices and protecting the vulnerable, this consistency, I believe, would benefit ministerial candidates who are seeking to transfer credentials across the denomination, and it would benefit congregations who are seeking assurance that candidates have been screened and are accountable to the same standards across the denomination. Without this kind of consistency, if a particular congregation or a conference doesn't choose to follow the standards, then a natural consequence of that is an erosion of trust in that conference or congregation. We don't know if we can trust an entity that doesn't follow the standards. It would diminish confidence in our ministers or candidates who come from a conference that isn't utilizing a resource. And most importantly, it means potential harm to members of our congregations and communities if people aren't following the standards. And finally, as I think as a conference minister, thinking about how to resource our congregations, how to support and provide accountability to our ministers, I believe that the approval of the bylaws resolution would give us as conferences more support, more backing to call on our congregations and ministers to implement best practices and policies in abuse prevention and response. And it would give more congregations and ministers more clarity about their own responsibilities in this regard. So thank you again for this opportunity to share.
Thank you so much, Eric and Amy and Heidi, for those reflections. Now we're going to actually turn a bit of attention towards explaining the actual resolution that they're talking about, and you'll note it's entitled Abuse Prevention and Response at Mennonite Church USA. If you go to the convention website, which hopefully you've already done, you'll be able to access both this resolution and also the prevention and accountability resource itself. You can link to from there. This is a proposed resolution actually coming from the Mennonite Church USA Executive Board, and it's what we would consider an organizational resolution in that it appends the current bylaws or adds to the current bylaws. And so at this time, we're going to turn back to John Carlson, moderator of MCUSA, to explain a bit about the resolution itself and the wording and some of the logic of the resolution. So thanks, John.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. And as Michael said, this is on the website. There's a link in the chat. I would encourage you to read it. It's actually a relatively short resolution. Sometimes when we pass church-wide statements, they are pages and pages and pages. This really is about 3 sentences, maybe 4, 1 sentence added to the current section of the MCUSA bylaws pertaining to congregations, and then another addition to the section of the MCUSA bylaws pertaining to area conferences. So I'm just going to read those for you, but again, would encourage you to read the full document. It's relatively short. So the language around congregations is that Article 3, so that's the section of the bylaws pertaining to congregations, be appended to include this item: abuse prevention and response. All congregations belonging to an MCUSA area conference will utilize the current version of the Prevention and Accountability Resource as approved by the MCUSA Executive Board as the guidelines for pastoral ethics, abuse prevention, and abuse response for all pastors, ministers, and/or ministerial leaders in the church. So in essence, what this is doing is delegates are committing on behalf of their congregation and on behalf of the whole that their congregation will recognize, respect, and follow this resource as it currently exists, and then also as it may be updated in the future. As Heidi noted, the executive board will sort of have the responsibility for sustaining this resource, but any changes to it would be vetted through the Constituency Leaders Council, or I believe the conference ministers would be able to speak into any future changes to this document. So delegates would be committing their congregations, and again, all of the congregations that are part of MCUSA, to using this resource. And then very similarly for the area conferences, all area conferences of Mennonite Church USA will utilize the current version of the Prevention and Accountability Project as approved by the MCUSA Executive Board as the guidelines for pastoral ethics, abuse prevention, and abuse response for all leaders credentialed by the area conference. So that is very similar, if not almost identical, to what congregations commit to. Then there's this additional commitment that area conferences are making. This includes, but is not limited to, meeting the education and training requirements of the resource and providing adequate staff, paid or volunteer, and financial support to accomplish the required functions of the conference listed in the resource. So there are 3 commitments that the area conferences make. One is that they will invest in training and educating their credentialed leaders and other leaders in the churches that are part of that area conference to ensure that those leaders are aware of best practices, have healthy boundaries trainings, all those sorts of things. Area conferences are committing themselves to that. They're also committing to establish a Michael, you might have to correct me on the language here, but I believe it's a congregational safety liaison. Do I have that phrase correct? A congregational safety liaison who will be the point person in each area conference to begin the process of responding to allegations of abuse or misconduct by credentialed or other leaders. And then also there is a financial support component of this. Again, there was a separate webinar to look at the resource itself. I would encourage you to go back and watch that. It's available on YouTube. But part of what this does is when there's a need for an investigation into misconduct, that investigation now is coordinated at the national level. And so part of what area conferences are being asked to commit themselves to is to helping fund that through a small contribution based on the number of credentialed ministers that they have in their area conference. So that is the meat, the substance of the resolution. It is appending the bylaws, the sections of the bylaws that have to do with congregations and area conferences, us committing ourselves together to making use of this prevention and accountability resource. So, Michael, is there anything that I'm missing there in that explanation?
Yeah, no, thank you, John. My hearing's not great in this context. So instead, I thought you said conference safety liaison. I think you said congregation, but the correct term is the conference safety liaison.
Thank you.
Each conference would have a safety liaison in that role. So, yeah. So thank you, John. Let's spend some time now answering some questions. And a few of them that came in kind of before. Yeah, they came in as people registered. Well, let's start with those. One of the questions, and I think is an obvious question, is what happens if a conference or a congregation would choose not to participate? How would we trust each other's processes. I don't know, Amy, if you want to answer that one or.
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to. So I mean, obviously there would be various different ramifications. But one that I would kind of want to focus on in thinking about this would be that when I personally have learned of churches or conferences shortchanging or greatly adapting the current misconduct process, I've unfortunately only seen that happen to make things easier on the accused, which means it becomes a less victim-centered process. So when we're not following best practices for a victim-centered process, we're sending a message, right? To current pastors, to future pastors, to current and future victims, unfortunately. There is a study that I've cited before in my study on women in ministry, and that I'll cite again. It was featured in The Atlantic magazine, and it says that the single biggest predictor of sexual harassment on the job, any job, is how permissive an organization is of that conduct. So in other words, if you take sexual harassment seriously, you'll see less of it in your organization. If you don't take it seriously, you'll see more harm. And so the answer to the question, like what happens if a conference would not participate with this robust, vetted, victim-centered misconduct process, studies show that conference is likely to see an increase in harms, unfortunately. So unless they're using the process to make it more strict or stringent for the accused, which is not as likely, if it's at all less victim-centered, then it will have that effect. So I'll let someone else. They may be asking more about the mechanism, which I think is an aspect of it that's worthy of talking about. But I wanted to mention this aspect of that question. So hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. Heidi or Eric, you're welcome to add if you want or no. I think Heidi talked a bit about it in her comments earlier. A question that just came in, I think, is probably a question for John. It says, curious to know what the bylaw stipulated as the needed percentage to approve the bylaw changes. So what percentage of affirmation is needed to pass this resolution?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a 2/3 majority vote of delegates present and voting at the delegate assembly. If we had not gotten this to delegates far enough in advance, it would have been 100% requirement. That is not the requirement because this was posted and delegates were made aware with sufficient time to process it. It will need a 2/3 majority to pass.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. Another question. So you'll see if you've read the resolution in the introduction, line 21, it uses this language. It says this proposal makes it mandatory for area conferences of MCUSA and congregations belonging to those conferences to follow the practices. In the resolutions itself, it uses the phrase "will utilize." But the question is, what does mandatory mean, or what does it mean that a congregation and a conference will utilize those resources? Yeah, Amy, do you want to answer that one?
I said ahead of time I'd be willing to answer some of these. Yeah, so I see the question, and this came up a lot, like at the CLC meeting with the conference ministers, of what does this mean? Like, how does this resolution affect autonomy? Because polity-wise, it is saying instead of opting in, there would be an assumption that this is now how things are handled. And that's part of what it means to be in MCUSA and not some other denomination, is our standards of practice and our bylaws. One thing that I think is important that has been mentioned, but if a misconduct process does not stand the test of time, it can be amended or replaced. So this resolution is not saying we'll use prevention and accountability policy forever, though I think it is a solid policy. It's just saying that we think this is important enough to agree on using a policy, right? So I've kind of been reframing it in my mind, instead of thinking in terms of like top down mandatory, like to think of it instead of living in community by its very nature takes away some of our individualism and autonomy. And so the question is, what are we willing to work together to agree on And what is it fine to do separately? So I think it goes without saying that the conference ministers and the executive staff on this call agree that prevention and accountability of harm and abuse is worth working together on, is one of those things.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Amy. One question we did get, and it was the difference between the language in both of these resolutions. One calls it the Prevention and Accountability Resource. The other calls it the Prevention and Accountability Project. With humility, I'm just going to confess a typo. It should be the Prevention and Accountability Resource in both pages, both places. And our team I didn't catch it, and our team didn't catch it. So we're sorry about that. But yeah, so they should both say the Prevention and Accountability Resource. That's what we call this new resource that we launched for the denomination. At this point, like all the questions that have been submitted live and all the ones that have come ahead of time have been answered. So I don't know if there's anything else that we need to cover. Anything, Eric, Heidi, Amy, or John, that you think we need to talk about that we haven't hit on yet? This is your last chance, you want to ask a question. Otherwise, we don't need to stay longer than we need to.
I just want to know, I've really appreciated it, and even in our conversations preparing for this, some of the perspective of Amy and Heidi and Eric, especially what you just heard Amy saying. It is really easy to frame this as, and it is a somewhat of a shift in our polity, and it can be easy to frame that as sort of like top-down, heavy-handed. The big bad denomination is going to boss us around and tell us what to do. But I think really what we're experiencing as this has been processed at so many different levels of church life is this emerging sense of we want to have a way to make this commitment together as a community. And this is one of the mechanisms that we're going to choose to do that through. Making a bylaw change is not going to solve all the challenges of the potential of ministerial misconduct in churches. We all will still have work to do in our local congregations, as area conferences. Those of us who are credentialed like myself, we have individual responsibility here to ensure that we are seeking to be healthy, remaining grounded in our faith, staying close to Jesus. All of those things remain crucially important. And one way we can express those commitments together is through enshrining. That's really not the word I want to use, but through bringing this into our bylaws. And so I've really appreciated. There's even been a shift in my thinking. I would say that when this was first introduced, I was pretty skeptical because it felt at odds with how I understand MCUSA polity. But the more I've listened and learned, the more supportive I've personally become of making this change.
Yeah. Thank you, John. Yeah, so there are no more questions. I want to thank everybody for coming, and special thanks to John, for Eric, Heidi, and Amy for your time, for your willingness to do this. I would say that if you haven't done so yet, register for convention. MCUSA convention is coming up in Greensboro, North Carolina, not South Carolina. And there will be a seminar during the convention on the prevention and orientation to the prevention and accountability resource itself. So there'll be another chance for that. As John mentioned, there is also a webinar that we had on that already. You can go back and look at that live. So that's really important. So please sign up for that. If you have any questions that didn't get answered, you can always email me directly. It's michaeld@mennoniteusa.org. And Crystal will put that in the chat. I'm glad to talk about this stuff. I'm glad to answer any questions you may have. Yeah, that as well. And then just to also highlight for the latest news, if you want to know the latest news about and events from MCUSA, make sure you subscribe to Piecemeal. That's MCUSA's weekly newsletter, and it's a great way to just kind of stay apprised of what's happening in Mennonite Church USA. Otherwise, thank you for being here, and may you have a blessed evening.